Hi everyone. This is a quick overview of what we spent a lot of time discussing, understanding, and even enacting last week. That is this idea of the genre feature that most academic inquiry projects have, the creating a research space introduction. And also, I want to use the Brannick piece that we read I'm just going to sort of reiterate what many of you answered in the discussion board last week, and talk about sort of where primary and secondary sources fall in writing papers like this. So let's begin with this creating a research space model. We learned about genre theory a few weeks ago, and now that we're looking at the creating a research space model, we're really seeing the fruits of what genre theory can provide. John Swales kind of puts his money where his mouth is and says not only does genre help us understand, how we can achieve our writing goals in certain situations, he says, here's the specific example, right? He analyzes an extensive amount of academic introductions and says, well, they all three basically do make this same, they all make these same three moves. And we read about them more extensively, but I think I like to just I kind of like to put my own, if I had to interpret these, move one is establishing the territory. What does that mean? Well, basically, the way I think of it, step one is, here's what we know. This is where we include secondary research and say, researchers have said X, Y, and Z about, our subject over the years. Step one, here's what we know. And this is, if you haven't made this connection yet, or if I haven't explicitly said this yet, the CARS introduction model is very much just a more formalized way of, joining the conversation. We already talked about that metaphor. This CARS model is just another way of it's a more formalized way in which we can join that conversation. And look, here we are in step one saying, well, here's what others have said. Here's the conversation that's gone before me. So Swales' first move, step one, establishing the territory, is basically just saying, well, here's what we know. Step two, it's not rocket science, is establishing a niche, right? A niche just means a little area of, in this case, it's a little area in which you can specialize. But to go on with my step one, step two, step three synopsis, establishing a niche is basically just you saying, well, here's what we don't know. That might look like, well, there's a gap in knowledge, or based on new research, we need to review this. Our reading shows us the different ways we can establish this. But really, if we're going to understand it generally, I think we can think of it as one. Here's what we know. Here's what others have said. Here's what we don't know. Researchers haven't yet explained this, or we haven't looked at how genre theory applies to this specific real-world rhetorical situation. And step three is naturally just you saying, here's how my research question will help us know what we don't know, right? So step one, what we already know. Step two, point out something we don't know. Step three, pose that question. My research question will explore blank. It will seek to answer what there isn't already an answer to. So there's Professor Snyder's CARS model in 3 very easy steps. So we already looked at what this looks like in Brannick, right? But to be really clear, what is Brannick's research question? And the Brannick piece is, I haven't chosen it for any specific example. It doesn't do these things, honestly, it doesn't do these things particularly well, but it just does them. Like, I could have picked really any example to focus on, because most academic inquiry, most research inquiry projects make these moves. So what does it look like in Brannick? Well, um, he really encapsulates his research question and kind of the entire CARS model that he's created by, he says, well, coaching as a complex literacy practice has not been examined. Boom, that is step 2. Here's what we don't know. Here's where attention hasn't been fixed yet. Of course, um, this comes later in his introduction, so he's already done step 1, but here's a very explicit example of step 2. Here's what we don't know. How do football coaches, as members of a specific discourse community, go about reading their players and the game in order to get optimal performance and a positive end result? Sounds like a research question to me. To figure this out, I conducted an ethnographic study on how the coaches at the University of Dayton go about reading people and reading the game, right? So really here, I think it's the most concise encapsulation of Brannick's research question. Hey, there's this idea of literacy. We see him establish that in he does step 1 in a lot of previous paragraphs. It's a pretty long introduction, right? Step 2, well, here's what we don't know. We haven't examined X. He's establishing a niche. And step 3, boom, here's my question. It's going to add to what we don't know. I just want to point out that this is, I think this is like a really important moment for us as developing writers. I think we're used to writing, like we probably did in the last project, the 1-paragraph introduction followed by a thesis statement at the end. Well, if we're truly gonna achieve step 1 and say, hey, listen, here's what's been said before, it's probably going to take more than a paragraph. And I just want us to pay attention to where Brannick's how long Brannick takes in establishing and creating a research space, right? Establishing the territory, bringing in all of your secondary resources to say, hey, here's what others have said. That's probably not going to happen in 1 paragraph, and that's okay. Brannick spends 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It takes him almost 14 paragraphs before he can say really concisely and convincingly, well, I've already showed you what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's my question, posed in relationship to what we don't know. He doesn't have one introductory, he doesn't achieve that CARS model in 1 paragraph, as I don't think we have to. He has multiple sections, right? And this is, to be really explicit here too, this is part of how we use secondary resources and primary resources differently in one of these, real world inquiry projects. Many of us pointed this out in the discussion board, but if our goal is to establish the territory, step 1, that means that we're really probably going to front load our paper with secondary sources. Here's what Smith has said. Here's what Jones has said. And then if we truly do pose this question that hasn't really been examined, if we've actually done our job well and chosen a research question that is going to produce new knowledge, then a lot of the research that we are going to use to support it is primary research. That holds up in the Brannick piece. And a lot of the other examples that we analyzed, I think secondary sources let us know what we already know, and then we use that to say, well, we know this, but we don't exactly know this, research question here, and then it's a lot of our primary resources that help us answer that research question. This is really review from the Driscoll piece, which we read weeks ago, but what is a research question? Well, the ultimate goal in conducting primary research is to learn about something new that can be confirmed by others and eliminate our own biases in the process. This is not just the domain of writing studies. This is science and social science. This is how we produce new knowledge. which is our goal in this discourse community report. It's a big goal of this course to actually contribute to the scholarship of writing rhetoric, literacy, etc. When's a research question? When should we have, and again, I'm reviewing because many of us have already determined and are now collecting data for our research question, but it can't hurt to review. When should we pose and begin collecting primary data? Well, it really makes sense for us to spend some time reviewing the secondary research on your topic first, right? Just as we needed to sort of listen to the conversation before we put in our or. I'm leaning on that old metaphor from weeks past. We need to know what others have said. Otherwise, we won't know if our research question is actually contributing new scholarship or if it's just repeating what others have already found. Right? And as no surprise, a research question or a hypothesis, we can also think of this sort of as hypothetical, like, before we begin to collect and analyze our data, we might say, well, I think that this is how this genre functions in my discourse community. But right, as always, it's got to be specific, it's got to be narrow, and it needs to be discoverable through primary research methods, which is why it's important for us to ask good questions, because we're going to sort of be forced to answer them. So we want to make sure we ask a question that we can, answer through the data that we collect and through our primary research. And we've looked at all kinds of examples of this, of general to specific, from wide to narrow, from non-debatable to debatable, and that applies to our research questions. What do college students think of politics and the economy? I would be hard-pressed to know how to conduct research that would answer that question. I probably would collect a lot of it, and then the analysis would be hard. If I focus that research question, what do students at Purdue University believe about the current economic crisis in terms of economic recoverability, right? The more we narrow, the less data we have to collect and analyze, basically. And I just want to point out, this can kind of be thought, you can kind of think of this as the qualifiers from Toulmin terms. Well, if you're going to ask a question about college students, you better survey college students all over the world. But if you put that qualifier in and say students at Purdue University, that really makes your job easier as a researcher and an analyst. So nothing really earth-shattering here. This isn't rocket science. And we all answered these questions pretty well last week. I basically have just, as I usually do in these reflection videos, I've just sort of synthesized and synopsized, looked at all together, kind of summarized the good answers that you all have provided the week previous. But it's worth reflecting, right? Creating a research space at its most basic. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and bam, here's my research question or hypothesis that will help us learn something new that we don't know. If we follow that model necessarily, it's going to really encourage us to use our secondary sources early on in that first step of saying, hey, here's what we know. And then after we pose that research question, we're probably going to lean pretty heavily on our primary research to answer it. That's not saying that we can't reflect on secondary sources, or that secondary sources can't help us make sense of the primary research we've done. For instance, you might want to, bring G back up and say, this data that I've collected is a perfect example of a person in this discourse community inhabiting what G calls an identity kit. It's not to say that we can't use secondary sources later, but generally that's the distinction. Secondary sources tell them what we know, and those primary sources are where we answer our own research question and really add something new here.